Genesis 38. Now it happened that at the time Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adullamite whose name was Hirah. And Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he took her and went in to her. So she conceived and bore a son, and he named him Er. Then she conceived again and bore a son, and she named him Onan. And she bore still another son, and she named him Shelah. And it was at Chezib that she bore him. Then Judah took a wife for Er, his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Er, Judah's firstborn, was evil in the sight of Yahweh, so Yahweh put him to death. Then Judah said to Onan, "Go in to your brother's wife, and perform your duty as a brother-in-law to her, and raise up a seed for your brother." And Onan knew that the seed would not be his, and it happened that when he went into his brother's wife, he wasted it on the ground in order not to give seed to his brother. But what he did was displeasing in the sight of Yahweh, so he put him to death also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Live as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up." For he thought, "I am afraid, lest ye also die like his brothers." So Tamar went and lived in her father's house. After a considerable time, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. And Judah was comforted, and he went up to his sheep shearers at Timnah, he and his friend Hirah the Adullamite. Then it was told to Tamar, "Behold, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep." So she removed her widow's garments from herself, and covered herself with a veil, and wrapped herself. And she sat at the entrance of Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah, for she saw that Shelah had grown up, and she had not been given to him as a wife. Then Judah saw her, and he thought she was a harlot, for she had covered her face. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, "Here now, let me come in to you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, "What will you give me, that you may come into me?" He said, therefore, "I will send you a young goat from the flock." She said, "Moreover, will you give a pledge until you send it?" Then he said, "What pledge shall I give you?" And she said, "Your signet and your cord and your staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her, and went in to her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and went, and she removed her veil from herself and put on her widow's garments. Then Judah sent the young goat by his friend the Adullamite to take the pledge from the woman's hand. But he did not find her, so he asked the men of her place, saying, "Where's the cult prostitute who was by the road at Enaim?" But they said, "There has been no cult prostitute here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I did not find her, and furthermore, the men of the place said, 'There has been no cult prostitute here.'" Then Judah said, "Let her keep them, lest we become a laughing stock. Behold, I sent this young goat, but you did not find her." Now it happened about 3 months later that it was told to Judah, saying, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot, and behold, she is also with child by harlotry." Then Judah said, "Bring her out and let her be burned." It was while she was being brought out that she sent to her father-in-law, saying, "I am with child by the man to whom these things belong." And she said, "Recognize this, and see, whose signet ring and cords and staff are these?" And Judah recognized them and said, "She is more righteous than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah." And he did not know her again. Now it happened at the time she was giving birth that, behold, there were twins in her womb. And it happened, while she was giving birth, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, "This one came out first." Then it happened, as he drew back his hand, that, behold, his brother came out, and she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself! So he was named Perez. Afterward, his brother came out who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and he was named Zerah. This chapter's terrible series of events started with Judah. Verse 1. It happened at the time that Judah went down from his brothers and turned aside to a certain Adullamite. What was he looking for? Well, we see what he saw. Verse 2, Judah saw there was a daughter of a certain Canaanite. He saw what he wanted. He took her and went into her. Judah descended from his brothers and turned aside, went to a pagan land to look for what he desired. This is somewhat similar to chapter 34 with Dinah. Chapter 34, verse 1. Dinah, the daughter of Leah, whom she had borne to Jacob, went out to see the daughters of the land. Dinah belonged to Jacob's family, but she wanted to go see what the other women were up to, and so she went out to a pagan land. God's people in God's family has no business leaving God's protection to look for what they want in the world. Sure enough, for Dinah, verse 2, a very similar thing happened. The prince of the land saw her and took her and lay with her and violated her. If we go out from God's community, we will be in great danger of being seen by sinful people and taken by their sin. Similarly, back in chapter 38, verse 2, it could also be the reverse, where it was Judah who saw and he took someone in sin. These chapters didn't just jump into verse 2, but verse 1, which gives us insight in how God's people flirt with danger and end up being sinned against or sinning him or herself. The main character in chapter 38 and the main sinner is Judah. He not only left his brothers to seek pleasure in a pagan land, he bore 3 sons with a Canaanite, 2 of which were evil and had to be put to death by God himself. He not only didn't know how to discipline himself in holy living, he also didn't know how to teach his sons. Then he said to his daughter-in-law, Tamar, "Live as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up." Why? Well, Judah didn't say this out loud, but he thought, "I am afraid lest he also die like his brothers." Well, a long time has passed. Verse 12 said a considerable time, and Tamar is no fool. In verse 14, she saw that Shelah had grown up already, and she still had not been given to him as a wife. So Judah is also a liar, not fulfilling his promise to Tamar. And Judah's lifestyle of sin was so consistent and so predictable that Tamar was able to pull off this trick on her father-in-law. And indeed, Judah was tricked to believe that she was just this anonymous harlot. And even sending the promised young goat to her afterward was just to get back his stuff. Verse 23, Judah said, "Let her keep them, lest we become a laughing stock." He wanted to avoid shame, but he seems to have very little concern of his own guilt. Then in verse 24, when he heard some news saying, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot, and behold, she is also with child by harlotry," Judah just went straight to assumptions, acted on his emotional reaction without first-hand information. There was no seeking to understand, and it was the accused or in this case, the already condemned person, Tamar, in verse 25, who had to speak up. And she was ready. She said, I am with child by the man to whom these things belong. Please recognize this and see whose signet ring and cords and staff are these. At this point, Judah was cornered. There must have been other people there, for verse 25 says, while she was being brought out. So whoever was bringing her out would have been able to see those things and recognize that those belong to Judah. So Judah probably had no choice but to admit it. And he was able to say, she is more righteous than I, and identified his sin as not giving her to his third son, Shelah. So we have a Judah who's out of control, emotionally reactive, lustful, deceitful, and sought out what he wanted from the world. And yet, despite this deeply and consistently sinful man, he's allowed to live. In contrast with verse 7, was evil in God's sight, and God just killed him. Same thing with Onan. But Judah receives dozens of verses of opportunity to repent. Many years must have gone by, having 3 sons, and his youngest son had already grown up. And so while the main character of this chapter is Judah, we might even think of the even more primary character, God himself, and why he, who is holy and has every right to strike sinners down immediately, as he did twice in this chapter, yet was so merciful and patient with Judah. It is clear in verse 10 that if we do anything displeasing in the sight of Yahweh, he has every right to put us to death. The wages of sin is death. And then in verse 7, with didn't even mention anything specific about what he did, but he was simply evil in the sight of Yahweh, so Yahweh put him to death. So when God's eyes of judgment sees evil, whether in the person or in the deed, he can immediately judge as the perfect judge, the creator and thus owner of this entire universe. But God kept Judah alive. God also kept me alive, and you. So has God been merciful to you? And that he's patient with you and me, that we might also learn to repent and thus grow closer to him. I'm thankful for our patient and merciful God. These are my thoughts. I hope to hear from you as well.